And welcome to WizeUp. I'm Paul Arthur. I want to talk today about Canada becoming an energy superpower. We've been promised that, right? Before we get into that, just a quick reminder, hit the subscribe button if you like us and tell your friends about us as well. Appreciate that. Our guest today is Dr. Ross McKitrick. He's a professor of economics at the University of Guelph, also a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. His website, rossmckitrick.com. Lots of helpful articles on that, by the way. You can get yourself a ton of education right there. So, Dr. McKitrick, thank you for making time for us today.
My pleasure, Paul.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Let's jump into, I guess, maybe our new Prime Minister, Carney, has stated that, we're going to change things at the federal level that need to be changed in order for projects to move forward. Okay, so this is a CTV interview, and then he was asked directly afterward if that includes Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill, right, or the emissions cap. His answer, absolutely, it could include both, which, now he didn't say that it also means that it could not include those bills. So, do you want to unpack that for us a bit?
Yeah, I think the big question confronting Canada right now is which Mark Carney did people elect? There are two very different Mark Carneys out there. There's the guy during the election campaign who was the pragmatic guy wanting to get projects done, wanting to develop the energy sector. But that's a pretty new Mark Carney. The Mark Carney that existed up to about 12 months ago was a net zero radical activist. He was fully into the climate agenda. He's published many, many reports through his Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, calling for oil and gas to be locked in the ground, existing pipelines to be dismantled, motor vehicles to be taken off the road. This is a guy who praised Greta Thunberg and her whole agenda. I think that we don't know which Mark Carney we got, but I suspect Mark Carney himself doesn't know which Mark Carney is currently Prime Minister, because he knows that all that happy talk about net zero and the energy transition a couple of years ago, when confronted with the reality of what this country needs, it would be a very destructive agenda. And but then again, he's put people like Stephen Guilbeault in the cabinet. He's brought in Jerry Butts as an advisor. He's surrounded himself with people committed to that net zero agenda. It sounds like his new environment minister is also a net zero activist. And then he's brought in some business people into his government who sound like they want to develop the economy. So he's created this big contradiction. And all we can do right now is, like I say, sit back and see which Mark Carney we got.
Right, yeah. If you look back again at the book he's written, Values, he's not a moderate when it comes to climate change action. He'd be more on the extreme end as far as I can tell. If these two issues don't get dealt with, again, Bill C-69, and as well as the emissions cap, if we don't see a coast-to-coast pipeline built, what impact does that have on Alberta's economy and Canada's economy?
Well, I guess right now the status quo is unfavorable to the energy sector. And his language in the election campaign was kind of passive. I'd like to see the status quo change, but I'm not going to do a whole lot to try to change it. So he might try to play this game where as the years go by and nothing is getting built, he might come out and say, hey, look, I tried, but so many different stakeholders, we couldn't get agreement. There's no consensus. I think if that's the case, then we're back to where we were, 6 months ago or a year ago, when it seemed like everybody in the country realized we have a serious economic problem in this country. It goes way beyond the energy sector. We have business investment across the board leaving the country. And one of our major sectors is the energy sector, and there just isn't the fixed capital formation going in there to take advantage of the resource that we have. obviously the pipelines and access to tidal water is a big issue. And during the election campaign, well, in response to the Trump trash talking about annexing the country and also complaining about our trade surplus with the U.S., it seemed there like people realized, perhaps belatedly, that we've done ourselves no favor by restricting pipeline development and preventing access of oil and natural gas to the global marketplace and imprisoning ourselves basically in the U.S. market. Um, but during the election campaign, Mark Carney was also very careful about his language, not to commit to pipelines, and not to
Right.
commit to fossil energy development. And even today, he talks about Canada being an energy superpower, but he may have in mind windmills and solar panels. And until we actually hear him talk about what he's going to do to build out the oil and gas sector and get hydrocarbons onto boats into the global marketplace, I just don't believe that he's the man to do it.
Yeah, like I say, time will tell, but that's certainly the track record that we've seen thus far. So I was thinking to myself this morning, watching, NHL hockey with my boys here. It's super competitive, right? And I thought, we live in a global competitive market when it comes to economies. Now, if I were the coach of an NHL team and I made a decision that, you know what, on principle, I'm going to make sure that our players are protected, that we're safe. Make sure you're wearing equipment that weighs 5 times as much as the opposition's equipment, and we're going to make our nets twice as wide as well. It's just a good thing. Trust me. Okay. Yeah. Now, as a coach, I should be fired if that's the case, right? So I'm thinking on the global stage, is that kind of what we're doing as Canadians, putting ourselves at a huge competitive disadvantage on purpose? And let me ask you this, I guess. How many other nations, there might be some, that are doing similar things as Canada is, putting our own restrictions on exporting oil and gas and so forth?
Well, not many nations are in quite the same position that we're in. So in Europe, there are a lot of climate regulations. Germany, for instance, with its attempt to force through an energy transition. But we can also look at them and see what happens. What's the implication of that? So in Germany, they've lost their industrial sector. It's departed from the country, and high energy costs are to blame. Britain's another example. They have lost their energy sector. They've just lost the last of their steel plants. Their manufacturing sector is disappearing. And again, high energy costs are the big drivers, and just all the restrictions related to the climate agenda. So in Canada, those kinds of things are happening, but we're also in the unique situation of being right next door to the United States, which is going 180 degrees in the opposite direction. President Trump won on an agenda of unleashing their energy sector, getting energy costs down, and the result is there's an investment boom going on underway. I don't think people quite realize the magnitude of the investment boom happening in the U.S. At the same time as Canada has effectively no capital formation happening. We've just enough investment to cover depreciation, but in some years it's a net negative. People are not investing in Canada. But year over year, the first quarter figures that came out from the U.S., fixed capital formation is up about 20% in the U.S. There's a huge boom. People around the world are investing in that economy, and that's going to just widen the gap for us. We already are way behind in capital per worker. We're way behind in productivity, incomes. And if we continue with this climate agenda that's way out of step with what the U.S. is doing, you just have to ask at the end of the day, why would anyone run large-scale manufacturing in Canada when you have the option of going to the U.S.? They'll welcome you with open arms. And so I'm assuming that at this point in the aftermath of the election, this is the conversation that's happening in a lot of boardrooms across the country. Now, the energy sector is different because there the resource is physically located in Canada. But it's going to be different conversations there about why would we bother with large, long-term capital investment, given the fact that the signals from Ottawa are that they only want this industry to operate for another 10 years or so, and then it needs to wind down altogether.
Well, we have people like former Liberal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. He's back at it, saying Trans Mountain Pipeline apparently, well, he says running at 40% capacity, and that experts are telling him, predicting that the global demand for oil and gas is going to peak in 2 years, and so what's the point of building more pipelines? So when somebody like Guilbeault, makes statements like this, I know he's not the environment minister anymore, but he's in cabinet, he's part of the government, making statements like that. How does that impact investors when they hear it?
Well, he's in cabinet, and he knows perfectly well that even though it's not his portfolio, he's firing a shot across the bow as the environment minister and the energy minister. And now what he's saying about peak oil is nonsense, of course. International Energy Agency and other groups like that are predicting steady increases in demand for hydrocarbons globally. But even if it was going to peak, there's still the question of, well, why shouldn't we be the suppliers? Why should we cede the market to Russia or Venezuela? We could displace their oil from the marketplace and their natural gas from the marketplace, and we can displace coal with natural gas. So even on his reckoning, it doesn't mean we just pack up and go home. It goes back, though, to this question of we have a contradiction in the prime minister, and now we've got a contradiction in the cabinet. We don't know. We will find out soon, but we don't know currently which government we elected.
Yeah. Is it concerning at all that our finance minister, Champagne, he's telling reporters that, by the way, Canadians shouldn't be expecting a budget to be tabled this year. I thought, wow, that's interesting. Should we be concerned?
Well, I guess it all depends on what kind of budget they have in mind. And look, they have a minority government, and budget bill is a confidence vote, and they're going to do everything they can to govern with as little exposure to Parliament as they can.
Mm-hmm.
And so that may be part of the reasoning. They may think we're
just in case
to bring a budget up because it could trigger a coalition of the opposition against us.
Right.
At the same time, though, there are structural problems in the economy that require a budget to fix, including issues around taxes and spending in general. The government inherited the $62 billion deficit. During the campaign, they talked about increasing it from there. And so without budgetary changes in the government, they're not going to address the overspending. However, I think at this point, some of our biggest challenges are regulatory. And so I'm really looking for signals on what are they going to do around that. You mentioned Bill C-69.
Yeah.
And the oil and gas sector emissions cap, things like that. I think that's where we need to get some details. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a couple more announcements realizing this is just a continuation of the same government that we had last year.
Sunny ways we were promised at one point by a previous prime minister who I won't name. Okay. Honda announcing they are postponing their $15 billion, I think that's what it was, their budget or their deal to produce EV vehicles in Ontario. Going to postpone it for at least 2 years, and also apparently shifting some of their production south of the border because of the tariffs. So, question, is that just tariffs? Or is this more to do with the dropping demand for EVs?
Well, it's both.
Okay.
The whole EV gambit has been a disaster, predictable disaster. The fact that it was the government, not the private sector, it was the government at every step of the way, throwing money like mad at EV battery plants, at EV stamping plants, at everything to do with the EV sector. The government just they approached it the way, I don't know if you remember the sprung greenhouse fiasco in Newfoundland a long time ago, where the government decided we're going to have hydroponic agriculture in Newfoundland, and private sector wouldn't touch it. But they nearly bankrupted the province, throwing money at a losing industry. And this is another money losing industry. I mean, Ford is the only major automaker that reports its EV division separately, and they're typically losing between $50,000 and $100,000 per vehicle with EVs. They can't make them for a price that people are willing to pay. And now Tesla is a bit different, but a lot of its revenue comes through selling credits under the various regulatory regimes that exist.
So that's essentially government funded then, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's taxpayer funding either way. But the auto companies have made it clear that it costs too much to make these things, and people aren't willing to pay that much money. And well, some people are willing to pay. There is a market for EVs, and they don't mean to.
But a much smaller
there's
market,
no hope
right?
for it, but it's a small market. It's a niche market, and it's also pretty saturated at this point. So in both North America and Europe, the big automakers are scaling back their production plans because there's no point making fields full of cars that people don't want to buy. Unfortunately, for Canada, after we'd sunk all this money into subsidizing the battery plants and production plants and so on, the U.S., through an executive order, President Trump canceled the EV mandate. And so there will still be a market for EVs in the U.S., but it's going to be much smaller than it was projected a year ago. In Canada, this isn't a thing. People will be in for a bit of a surprise next year because we have an EV mandate that kicks in for the 2026 model year. I believe it's 20% of auto sales have to be EVs. And in order to make that happen, they will have to raise the price of gasoline-powered cars. The automakers, if they don't make their sales mandate, it's a fee of $20,000 per car that they get penalized.
Wow.
So we could be looking at pretty substantial price increases for gasoline-powered cars in order to force buyers to look at the EVs that they pretty clearly don't want to buy.
You know, if it's one thing that Canadians enjoy, it's being forced to do things against their will, isn't it? Okay, wake up call. No, it's not. So by 2035, I got the dates right there, the EV mandate from the federal government is to have 100% of all new vehicles to be EVs. And so how is that doable? Is it... is it like
if there's a dramatic change in technology such that people would have bought the EVs anyway, then in that case it's doable. But as long as it's a case where you have to force people to buy cars they don't want to buy and charge them a price way above what they were willing to pay, no, it won't work. I published a study last year in the Canadian Journal of Economics on what this means. As they phase in this kind of a mandate, if it's against consumers' wishes, it will result in the demolition of the Canadian auto sector. I mean,
that'd be devastating for our economy. I mean, man.
Yeah, the losses will just be too big even for the government to paper over with subsidies. The sector will just have to shut down. And now I think what will actually happen is by 2027, at the latest, this whole fiasco will be so costly the government will have to back down. But they're going to waste a lot of money between now and then.
Well, yeah, I certainly hope they do back down. I mean, I can't see it happening. In 10 years, how... I just don't see it. How long would it take to build even, the EV infrastructure across Canada-wide, right? That's another factor, right? Our roads have to be built, more solidly, I understand, because they weigh more with the, the batteries and so forth. So a lot of things to consider. I guess, are any other nations at this point that you're aware of mandating, X amount of EVs have to be sold?
Yeah, so Europe has an EV mandate, but they've also had to relax it, and it's also all in the future. So it's there's deadlines. There's a few small, like Norway, for instance, fairly high take up of EVs,
Okay.
but they pay subsidies. They pay huge subsidies for consumers. California offers very large subsidies as well. Outside of those areas, you just don't see the take up at the level that we're being forecast.
Yeah.
So we do have experience with countries that announce EV sales targets and then relax them because we're not anywhere close to them. And then in Europe, the other issue is that companies like Volvo and BMW that had said they're going to switch entirely to EVs, they've abandoned that and they've said, well, we'll keep producing gas-powered cars because that's where the market is. Canada would be an outlier if we have this 20% and then 30% the year after rule and they stick to it. That would be.
Yeah, we should maybe, pay some attention to what's happening around the world. It would probably be very helpful. We also have a federal mandate for net zero electricity. I think it's by 2050. So basically all our electricity generation power plants, they got to be net zero. That's not a lot of time it takes quite a while to build new plants, right? And of course, my other question is, a couple questions. One, does it make any economic sense? And what's the cost of it going to be if we can actually get there? And will it be reliable when I look at what's happened, for example, in Spain and Portugal?
On the second question there, people need to understand something about the electricity system. You need two types of generators. You need what are called the baseload power plants, which generate a low-cost, steady flow of electricity. And then you need the variable generators that are fully controllable and can go up and down on a minute-by-minute basis during the day to make sure you balance supply and demand. And you need both kinds. So in Ontario, we have a lot of nuclear and we have hydro, and they're good for baseload power, just that low-cost, steady voltage that runs the system. And then we have natural gas plants that can go up and down during the day to balance the daily cycle and even the minute-by-minute changes. Now, where do wind and solar fit into that? And this is the problem, that they're not either type. They're not steady base load, because obviously the wind and the sun both change. And they're not variable because you can't control them. So you can't just phone up the wind turbines and say, generate more electricity 5 minutes from now, because they don't control the wind. So they're hard to integrate into a power system. Now, there might be people think with offshore, for instance, if you've got a steady enough wind that, it's sort of like baseload. There are limited locations where you might get away with that, and it's very expensive. But when the government says this net zero requirement for the power system, they don't explain how do you balance supply and demand. And where do you get the control that we currently have with both coal and natural gas-fired power plants? What replaces those? The only thing I hear people talk about is enormous battery installations. And there is just nothing like a demonstration plant anywhere that this would work on the scale we're talking about. And it's frightening to think if let's say you've got a 2-week stretch of really hot weather in the summer, the wind is gone still. Sure, there's sun, not at night though. And you're relying on batteries to run the entire Canadian economy for 2 weeks.
It just doesn't make sense, does it? So this hasn't been
make sense.
If I'm hearing you correctly, basically the government planning here hasn't done a good job of planning. They haven't actually thought this through practically step by step. Let's talk with the industry experts. What's needed? What do we have at hand to make this happen? And we don't have stuff on hand to make it happen.
Right. And then with regard to what happened in Spain and Portugal, when you get up to very high levels of penetration of renewables, those systems are unstable. They don't have the control over the underlying oscillation of the voltage. And that appears to be what happened in Spain. There was just a slight deviation in the oscillation of the system, and that you don't have the momentum from large physical generators like nuclear and hydro plants and gas plants that have large flywheels in them. And so an oscillation hit, part of the grid shuts down to protect itself, and then that wheels around to the rest of the grid. And in the aftermath, there were a lot of people making excuses, trying to say, "Oh, it's nothing to do with all the renewables," and that makes it the whole thing even worse. Because then what they're saying is, for ideological reasons, we're not going to learn any lessons from this. It just means get used to it. It's going to get worse and worse. You go from being an industrialized country to a third world country pretty quickly if you have a power system that on a regular basis completely shuts down.
I mean, it's basically virtue signaling at the cost of the economy and of everyday citizens. I mean, this matters, long term. I mean, it can't keep on going that way. Something's going to have to switch, I think. I mean, even if Canada managed to hit net zero 100% across the board, what would that actually do for global, the global climate? I mean, again, we're such a small portion of what's happening around the world, right?
Well, yeah, there's partly the issue. You could shut the whole Canadian economy down. It wouldn't make any difference to the global climate.
Right.
But even worse, as industry relocates outside of Canada, let's say it moves from Canada to China, so you go from an electricity system that's quite clean in Canada, a lot of nuclear, a lot of hydro, a lot of non-emitting sources of electricity, and then you go to China or India where it's all coal-based. So you take the same amount of industrial activity out of Canada, move it to India or China, and you actually have more CO2 emissions after you're done. So we're not doing the climate any benefit by making it impossible to run heavy industry in Canada.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm running out of time here. We've got to leave it there. But wow, that's thought-provoking right there, what you just stated. So thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it, Dr. McKitrick.
My pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
I encourage people, again, some really helpful articles at rossmckitrick.com. Thank you for watching. You can email me with any suggestions you have, paul@wiseup.ca. Don't forget to hit subscribe, tell your friends about us, wiseup.ca.